Welcome to all who are with us tonight. My name is Claire Schaeffer-Duffy. I am the program director of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions. We are a small nonprofit in the city of Worcester committed to building a culture of peace. And that includes programs of peace education, like this one that we're hosting tonight, where we spotlight voices for nonviolent alternatives in present-day conflicts. We also do a lot with upholding nonviolent social histories. The center has a walking tour of Worcester's peace history that we run in the fall and spring. And we're engaged in peace advocacy. So relative to tonight's topic, the center has been a year-long partner with a multi-faith coalition in the city working for a ceasefire in the Gaza-Israel war. And so that's a little bit about the center. And before I introduce our esteemed guest, I would like to just go over a couple of housekeeping rules. We had a lot of registrants tonight for the center. We typically have smaller forums for our webinars. And tonight we had a great turnout. So we're going to do our questions a little bit differently. You're not going to get to raise your hand. You can put your questions in the chat box. We'll allow our presenters to speak about their new book for the first 35 minutes of the evening, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. And we have two other wonderful people helping moderate the questions. And they are Roxanne Bruno, who is with the Multi-Faith Coalition here in Worcester, and also with another Western Mass group working on peace and justice. And we have Abby Yano with Massachusetts Peace Action. So they'll be keeping track of the questions. And that is the simple, very, very simple format. So we'll let our presenters speak, and then we will take a Q&A. And the formal closing of our event will be at 8:30. Those who have more questions for our speaker, I'll be here to keep us going for just a little bit. And I am realizing to my horror that I need to step into another room to get my material for an introduction. So I ask your patience. I'll be right back. The center is very pleased to host tonight two really well-informed and dedicated writers, journalists for peace in the Middle East. Helena Cobban is a writer and researcher on international affairs. She lives in Washington, D.C. In 1984, Cambridge published her seminal study, The Palestinian Liberation Organization. 3 of the books that she authored by herself dealt with political and strategic developments in the Arab-Israeli theater. The rest were more global matters. For 17 years, she contributed a regular column on global issues to the Christian Science Monitor and Al Hayat. In 2010, she founded Just World Books, which has published groundbreaking titles by Palestinian, Zionism Questioning Jewish, and other authors. In 2016, she was co-founder of Just World Educational, which she now serves as president. Her current main writing platform is globalities.org, and I encourage you to check that out because Helena is giving a lot of news that you might not read in the mainstream press, or a very more in-depth analysis of the region. Rami Khouri is a Palestinian-American academic and journalist whose family resides in Beirut, Amman, and Nazareth. During his 50-year career in journalism, he was managing editor of the Jordan Times and the Daily Star in Beirut, and contributed reporting and opinion pieces from the Middle East to the Financial Times, NPR, BBC Radio, and other outlets. And I first heard Rami on Morning Edition. He was frequently the voice that was consulted when the news of the day was on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Rami founded and managed the Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. He's been a Harvard Nieman Journalism Fellow and a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a Fellow of the Palestinian American Society for the Study of International Affairs in Arab East Jerusalem. He's currently a Distinguished Fellow at IFI, a Senior Fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a regular contributor to Al Jazeera Online and a member of the Just World Ed Board. His texts and interviews are available on X at Rami Khouri. I just want to mention that there is a personal connection with our two speakers, at least a local connection, and that is that Helena is a member of the Friends meeting in Washington, D.C., and it is the Society of Friends that offers the office space to the center. We've had a long-standing relationship with them here in Worcester, so we cannot do without the friends. They keep the world more peaceful. And I just learned that Rami is the keeper of the papers for the late journalist Anthony Shadid. And he, for those who don't know, he was just really a wonderful writer who started at the Boston Globe here in New England and then went on to write for the Washington Post. He was also the former husband of Michael True, founding member of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, niece. And Michael was so proud to state that, like, Anthony's in the family. So his writings are being curated and kept by Rami, which I'm so heartened to hear. And Worcester has a little connection there. So without further ado, well, I do want to say one more framing for tonight. We are always interested in nonviolent solutions at the center. And this entails knowing everyone's perspective, the perspectives of opponents, the perspectives of those who are ostracized. So it is in that spirit that we are very eager to hear from two people who have spent a lot of time studying Hamas, as well as other groups related to Palestinian governance, and to give us deep information. So we welcome you. And again, thank you so much for making time. I know you're doing a lot of speaking gigs on your book. So we really are so grateful that you've included Worcester in your circuit. Helena, you have to unmute yourself.
So first of all, are you Claire or Therese? I'm a little confused.
I'm Claire.
My
mailing address is Therese.
Got it. Okay. So that's good to know. And thanks for that lovely introduction. Rami, how do you want to handle this? You want to go first?
No, you go ahead, set the stage, explain everything, and I'll just provide a little bit of entertainment.
No, you can like deepen what I say.
Shake him up a bit. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Because the two of us don't necessarily agree on everything, but I think we agree on like 95%, something like that, which is...
That's not bad. That's pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a pleasure to work with you on this project, by the way. So
it's good, mutual.
Yeah, actually, Rami came onto our board in March, at shortly after March, at a board meeting when we agreed to do this project. So the name of the project is Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. And actually, Rami contributed a lot to just framing the title of the project, which is the same as the title of the book, because we wanted to make it clear that our interest is in deepening people's understanding of this movement that has been so widely disparaged and demonized in the mainstream media and in international politics, indeed. So for the first, I want to say, 5 or 6 months of the terrible ongoing genocide in Gaza. In that period, there were, I think, 3 United Nations Security Council resolutions that were vetoed by our government because the resolutions failed to include an explicit condemnation of Hamas. So, do you condemn Hamas has become a kind of mantra in the mainstream media for, like, we won't even let you into this discussion unless you condemn Hamas. Well, okay, there's a lot to condemn. There's a lot to condemn about the government of Israel. Indeed, there's a lot to condemn about our own government. But, you know, none of those are put forward as litmus tests, that you can't even say anything unless you, before we let you put your foot in the door, condemn this organization. And the demonization has gone much deeper and further than that. There have been many, many lies, what I would call disinformation, as opposed to mere misinformation. The difference being that if you misinform somebody, it's not clear whether you know what the truth is or not. You might pass on a rumor or whatever. You might pass on something that you think is true, but it turns out not to be. But disinformation is an intentional campaign to slander and spread lies about an organization or an individual or whatever. So Hamas has been subjected to disinformation for a long time, but specifically, most pointedly, since October 7th, 2023. So we've had such charges, such claims as the fact that they burned 40 babies, or sometimes by some accounts, 40 babies had their heads chopped off. That's the one that our president, Joe Biden, still seems to believe. He has repeated that a number of times. And he has never said, oh, gee, I'm sorry, I was misinformed. I didn't understand what had happened. In fact, he said, I have seen videos. I have no idea who showed him such videos. But of course, all these things, it's a long tradition in war making that you exaggerate the offenses that the opposing side has committed. And, you know, that's probably as old as the history of warfare. But in a specific context of a struggle against military occupation or a struggle against colonial domination, the spreading of disinformation and scare propaganda becomes almost an art form. So I was growing up in England in the 1950s at a time of, you know, rolling decolonization of many parts of the global South that had until then been part of the British Empire. And, you know, the one that I remember in particular was the Mau Mau. You know, the Mau Mau in Kenya. We were told the most terrible things about them. And then suddenly, you know, one day there's the Governor General of Kenya hauling down the Union Jack, reaching his hand out to Jomo Kenyatta, who had been closely associated with the Mau Mau all along, and who probably until 2 weeks prior had been, you know, in a British jail, accused of association with this, you know, very scary organization. And, you know, so they exchanged salutes, and then, you know, it's President Kenyatta and goodbye to the British Empire from Kenya. And that happened in many, many different places. And something very similar happened at the end of the Vietnam War in this country, where, you know, there was a lot of very scary propaganda. And I remember reading some of this in Reader's Digest when I was a kid, you know, about the Viet Cong and the NLF, the National FLN, I guess, whether it's French or English, and then, you know, suddenly there is Nixon in Paris signing a peace accord with them. So I think we need to be aware of that framing. And when Just World Educational launched this process, initially it was a series of webinars, and you can still find the webinars on our website, www.justworldeducational.org. And we're still getting good feedback to the webinars. And what we did was Rami and I co-hosted throughout the month of May this series of 5 webinars with people who are very good and deep experts on the history and political development, political dynamics of the organization known as Hamas. So, you know, anybody who wants to dive into that kind of, you know, political history in depth is very welcome to do so, and has, you know, there are a lot of books and articles that do this already. But I think what we wanted to do was to make some of this expertise readily available to the non-specialist public as a way of countering the demonization and the disinformation. So we had these webinars that Rami and I co-hosted with the assumption that most of the people attending the webinars wouldn't be, you know, Middle East specialists. They wouldn't be counter-terror specialists. They would be concerned citizens. And we had wonderful, wonderful attendance at them. And then we made transcripts and made them available. You can find them, all this material, on our website. If you want to spend roughly 6 hours watching 5 very informative webinars, I urge you to go to that space on our website where they are all presented to the public. But it may be that, like me, you're somebody who learns more easily through reading written text, and that you want a book. I mean, I love books, you know. You can go backwards, you can go forwards, you can like check an earlier reference. So that afterwards we made the transcripts, as I said, we produced we lightly edited the transcripts, and that's the origins of this book, which builds on the conversations that we had with Dr. Paola Caridi, who is an Italian specialist on Hamas, Dr. Jeroen Gunning, he's actually, I think, Dutch, but he teaches at King's College London or SOAS, or one of the London universities. And Jeroen's contribution was actually really, each of our 5 guest experts brought something different and special to the conversation. Jeroen is a co-founder of a field of study called critical terrorism studies. And as soon as he said that, I was like, yes, of course that's what we need, because I live in Washington, D.C. This city is full of very heavily funded, and let me say funded mainly by the military-industrial complex, research centers and centers for this and that connected with terrorism and counterterrorism. So, you know, it all helps to build up the appetite for and the justification for military interventions around the world. But Jeroen and his colleagues in the field of critical terrorism studies try to take some of this apart and say, look, you know, you guys are just exaggerating. You're not looking for the peaceful paths to conflict resolution. And then we had Dr. Khalid Haroub, who's a Palestinian specialist currently in Qatar. Nearly all these people have published more than one book about Hamas itself, but we were able to have these conversations that bring their expertise to the general public. Moeen Rabbani, who is a wonderful specialist in all things Middle Eastern. Actually, I like to say West Asian, because I think West Asia is a better description of that region. It's not so Eurocentric, but my husband and I have this continuing, like, no, you should call it Middle East, whatever. And then the last one was Dr. Azam Tamimi. These last three are all Palestinian scholars. Azam Tamimi sits in London. He was a founder of something called the Institute for Islamic Political Thought, and he's a deep specialist both in the history of Hamas and in the relationship between Islam and democracy. So, you know, as I said, they all brought something different to it. And in the book, we know, well, our target audience is really people who are not specialists, but who want to learn, concerned citizens. So we have a bunch of appendices, we have a glossary, we have a timeline. So we're hoping that it's going to be accessible to everybody. And well, that's my pitch for the book. Over to you, Rami.
Thank you, Helena. And thank you for Claire and all your colleagues for inviting us and having us on this event, and for the audience to tune in. I'll talk for a few minutes about why it's important to understand Hamas. And of course, this is not only applying to Hamas, it applies to any kind of movement like this, which is involved in a military or a nationalist struggle of some sort. And especially if you're fighting, if you're a country of the US or UK or whatever, you're actually fighting in Israel, of course, if you're fighting against Hamas, and you've been fighting against them for decades and decades, it's pretty important to know more about them, who they are, where they came from, why they were created, what they're looking for, and how do they carry out their business, political, cultural, military, economic, social, all the different dimensions in which these groups like this operate. So the first thing I'd say is it's important to understand Hamas, particularly if you're waging war against them. And this is the case with Israel and the United States. And you're not only waging war against Hamas, you're waging war against any group in the region or country, but it's mostly individual groups now, non-state entities like Hamas and Hezbollah and Ansarullah and others. If you're waging war against these people, you really should take a few minutes or a few hours and learn more about them, because this was not done in Vietnam or Afghanistan or South Africa or other important places where there was long-running battles between Western countries and their indigenous foes or people who resisted them in the South, in the global South. And if the US had taken the time to understand what the Viet Cong were and why they were doing what they were doing, and the same for the Taliban, and tried to not just to understand them, when you understand them, it doesn't mean you agree with them. You just are aware of why they're doing what they're doing. And some of it you might find sensible, some of it you find maybe outrageous, some of it you might find is terrorism, whatever your reaction. But unless you know exactly who these people are and what they're doing, you're not going to have any kind of coherent engagement. And the consequences is what happened in Vietnam, what happened in Afghanistan, South Africa, and many other places around the world, as Helena mentioned. And this is something that has been going on for most of the last century. So that's the first reason why you should understand Hamas. The second reason is Hamas wants to be understood. They're not some secret clandestine group like Al-Qaeda was or somebody else. That they don't make their views known. They don't engage with people. No, Hamas wants to engage with the world, and they want to be understood for what they really are, which is a nationalist resistance movement that uses uses religious values as a motivating force, but is deeply anchored in Palestinian national rights and aspirations and demands. It's a nationalist Palestinian group. It's not like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a regional group. So that's the second reason why you really should get to know them, because if you understand what they're all about, you'll then understand the conflict better. And the reason that one should understand the conflict better is to avoid doing what has happened in the last year, actually in the last 20 years, but it took off big time since October 7, this explosion of violence, mostly by Israel now after the initial attack by Hamas on South Israel. And it's now spreading. You saw it happen in Lebanon. It's now, Syria is falling apart as we speak. Iraq is probably next. Iran is as a target. So what happened, what Hamas was part of, did not by itself initiate the conflicts that we're seeing now. The October 7 was a spark that set off the bigger conflicts, but that spark was able to set off a bigger conflict because the tinder and the environment for a big explosion was set by 40 years of Israeli subjugation, occupation, and sanctions, et cetera, and United States and Western European policies supporting Israel totally and all of its inhuman policies in Gaza. There was a moment in Gaza, I think in the 1990s, when UN reports showed that the average height of Palestinian children was about 2 centimeters lower than it should be. In other words, the population was physically shrinking. They were getting smaller because Israel wasn't allowing enough protein to get into Gaza. They were withholding essential needs, especially for babies and infants. And this was a UN report. It wasn't some crazy group. So this kind of activity over years and years and years creates an environment in which an attack like Hamas did can be better understood. Again, you don't necessarily agree with it if you don't want to, but you have to know why it happened. I'd add one more dimension to this, which is the work that Jared Kushner did in creating the Abraham Accords was also a contributing factor, because what the Abraham Accords did is it created the illusion in the West, especially an illusion in the delusional West that said, oh, we can get all the Arab countries to have normal ties with Israel, and then we will go from there and make life better for everybody. And of course, that's a delusion, because first of all, the agreements wasn't between people, it was between small, unelected, undemocratic, unrepresentative governments. But second of all, what happened was by pushing that line, and then Biden, of course, followed up immediately and worked overtime with equally delusional people like Brett McGurk and others going around to the Saudis and saying, okay, if you and the Israelis make normal ties, we're going to give you all kinds of weapons and security guarantees and stuff. And so this process kept going and going. And one of its consequences was that it marginalized the Palestine issue in the public debate, particularly among Arab governments. And this was a contributing factor to why Hamas made the October 7 move, because it wanted to disrupt this tendency of marginalizing Palestine by allowing small unelected governments in Arab countries to make deals with Israel and the US and totally disregard the sentiments of the majority of Arab people and the rights of the Palestinians. If you don't understand these factors, you'll never understand why we've just experienced what we've experienced in the last 14 months, the plausible genocide, as the UN calls it. So that's another good reason why you should know these people, any people like this. Hezbollah is another group. By the way, you're looking for people to know? Start reading about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this group in Syria that's now suddenly emerged. And now, magic, there's about 50 Hayat Tahrir al-Sham experts in Washington and New York who pontificate about them. The vast majority don't know the realities about them in depth, only superficial things that they hear from other non-experts in Washington. But this is a process that happens over and over and over again, and it's something that Western powers and Israelis and other powers that colonize and subjugate people should really wake up to, because it only creates further problems down the road. And just in the media today, we started reading reports coming out of northern Iraq and northern Syria that ISIS, the Islamic State, is trying to make a comeback now in the it's not chaos yet, but in the unstable situation that Syria is going through. So that's another reason why it's important to know about these groups and what they're doing and why they're doing it. Another reason I would say is that the Hamas movement reflects accurately the totality of Palestinian national sentiment and consensus, and has been for the last 20 years or so, at least, has been part of that national consensus, whether it's reflected in the prisoners document, which was the first time that we had a real national Palestinian consensus among the leftists and the communists and the centrists and the Islamists, and all the Palestinian groups created a document that they signed. And this carried the day for about a decade or so, until the great split happened between Hamas and Fatah. But even with the split, the position that Hamas takes on the major Palestinian national issues, occupation, self-determination, statehood, refugee rights, international law application, UN resolution application, these big issues that shape the Palestinian national doctrine, Hamas is very much in the center of that, and has been actually very involved in creating that kind of consensus. And they're doing it yet again today as we speak. A delegation of Hamas and Fatah is meeting in Cairo, creating a joint position that will help restart the negotiations for the exchange of hostages and prisoners, Israeli hostages in Gaza and Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. And that is happening because Hamas and Fatah are negotiating, and then they'll talk to the US and with the Egyptians and the Qataris. And so this is a group that is not just willing to be involved in political action. They are usually at the center of any meaningful mechanism or effort to push forward a political resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian and the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. But Hamas is important to understand because it helps you understand the entire Palestine issue. And that means understanding the historical context, which Israel and most people in the West don't want to discuss if it happened before October 7, which is a mistake, because October 7 did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a long historical context. And understanding Hamas helps you understand the elements of that context. And it also then clarifies the elements that can lead to a resolution of that conflict. And in fact, Hamas, on at least 9 or 10 different occasions, offered to the Israelis directly and to the United States directly, or sometimes indirectly, sometimes directly, like the one time they sent a letter to George Bush after they won the election in Gaza in 2006. So they've offered about 10 times a way to negotiate with the Israelis a permanent ceasefire to resolve the issues between them, leading to a permanent state of no fighting, no war, and that would need essentially a withdrawal from the occupied territory by Israel, resolving the refugee issue on a basis that's acceptable to both of them. Nothing's going to be imposed on anybody. They both have to agree, and creating a Palestinian state, a peaceful, non-violent Palestinian state next to a peaceful, non-violent Israeli state. We're a long ways from that, but it's important to understand that Hamas has offered to do that at least 9 or 10 times. And I'd make 2 last quick points, and then we can have questions. It's important to understand Hamas because so much of the action around the Middle East and in other parts of the world is driven by groups like them, non-state armed actors, nationalist actors. These are groups that emerge out of a context in which a population of some sort, of some size, is denied its rights, like the Native Americans were denied their rights, like the indigenous people in Australia or other places were denied their rights by colonial domination. In the Middle East, what you're seeing is people who were denied their rights, like the Palestinians. Palestine was offered, the British promised to make Palestine a Jewish home in 1917, when Palestine was 93% Palestinian Arab, including my family in Nazareth, who are still there. 93% of Palestine was Arab, and there was about 6%, 7% local Jewish population that had always been there and lived peacefully with the Arabs. These were Palestinian Jews, is what they were. They were there for years, and the Arabs made up 93%. So when this land suddenly is promised by a colonial power to become a Jewish home, you know that's going to create a problem. And it did, and it has, and it's gone on for over a century now. And here we are, the Hamas group is the last Palestinian group that has put up a fight politically, militarily, and in other ways to resist this kind of colonial imperial subjugation. They're taking a beating, of course, and so are other people. Anybody who's opposing the Israeli settler colonial imperial ravages around the region is getting beat up. But that's part of history. You don't gain independence by writing petitions to the UN or hiring a fancy lawyer in Washington or London. You resist, and resistance is political, it's economic, it's farming, it's educating your kids, teaching culture, learning songs, knowing how to cook your traditional foods, and fighting oppressors who oppress you, fight them militarily, particularly, especially if you only fight against the armed forces who are oppressing you, not the civilians. But in any of these contests, you're going to get civilians who are hurt, and in some cases, there's attacks against civilians. Those are terror attacks. They're carried out by all groups now and then. Some people do them more than others. The US has done this, Britain has done this, Israel has done it, Turkey has done it, everybody has done it, the Palestinians have done it. Nobody denies that. But the overwhelming majority of what Hamas is and does and wants is not terror, it's peaceful coexistence based on national rights, anchored in a national identity, and manifested in a political process that they're trying to achieve. And the last point I make is that if you want to understand how to achieve a peaceful situation, wherever it may be in the Middle East and South Asia and East Asia and Central Asia, wherever there may be conflicts, if you want to get to a peaceful situation, you have to understand the linkages between religious identity, cultural traditions, national sentiments, geography, and shared historical experiences. And Hamas captures that in Palestine better than anybody else, as does Hezbollah in Lebanon. And you'll see some of this in the groups in action in Syria now, who are battling to achieve their rights in Syria against the oppression that they have felt from many different sources. And this is one of the difficulties in the Middle East today, that there's so many people oppressing indigenous people that it's hard to keep track. But I'll stop there. Those are just the top of the chart, headlines of why it's important to understand Hamas. If you read the book or read other books or talk to Hamas members, even better, or listen to some of their materials, and you still think that they're evil terrorists and you want to fight them, go ahead and fight them. And the results will be what we've seen in Vietnam and Afghanistan and now throughout the Middle East. The difference now is that this fight is spreading and threatening much of the Middle East, which will threaten global trade and stability and migration and other problems as well. So we have to resolve these issues peacefully with the rights to all. And to do that, we have to understand what everybody wants. Thank you very much. I hope that's useful.
Thank you so much. And now we'll invite participants to put questions in the chat box. I have a few myself just to get us going, and we also have one from the audience. I have several. You mentioned the prisoner document. I wonder if you could explain that more to the audience, Rami. That's one question. Another general question is if, as people who sit in both realities, in other words, you're sitting in the U.S., you know what the U.S. audiences are exposed to, and you have both lived in the region of West Asia or Middle East and written and interviewed people there. What are the top three misrepresentations or misunderstandings that are prevalent in the American audience regarding Hamas that you see, and what's the corrective? To be more specific, we in the US are told that Hamas in their own governance in Gaza are highly oppressive, that they rule by strong arm, that there hasn't been an election in Gaza since 2006. They're they are the harm of the Palestinian people. So that would be one American framing, and what would be the corrective on that. So those are two questions, and then I've got a lot more, but let's take those two. So explain the prison, the bringing together of the different groups through the prison statement.
Yeah, let me answer a little bit about the prisoners, and then Helena can take over more. The prisoners document is a critical document in the history of modern Palestine. It was an agreement achieved by prisoners in Israeli prisons. They were leaders of groups like Hamas, Fatah, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Communist Party group, Islamist Muslim Brothers, all kinds of groups that were represented in Israeli prisons. And the leaders got together, regularly met and talked about these things, and came up with a document that they all signed on behalf of their people. This was the first really clearly national consensus document anchored in the credibility and legitimacy of the Palestinian people, represented by their most representative people would be the people, their leaders in prison. And this document laid out what the Palestinians want. They want self-determination. They want a Palestinian state. They want not to be occupied. They want this. They were willing to go along with international norms enshrined in UN resolutions, for instance, or international law. And that's been a very important baseline that continues to pertain today. It has to be updated, obviously, for some things. So I urge people it was in 2006 it was released. And Hamas's charter has been changed over the years a couple of times to make sure that it's in alignment with this national consensus that the prisoners' document represents. In terms of misperceptions, there's many. I'll just mention one, and then Helena can add more. The biggest misperception, I think, that I encounter in the U.S., not just about Hamas, but about Palestinians and often about Arabs and often about Muslims. I mean, it gets pretty big, the scale of misunderstanding. But the biggest one is that we hate the Jews and we want to kill Jews. We're anti-Semites. We don't want to have a Jewish state. And this is totally untrue. The Palestinian people, the Arab people have all recognized Israel repeatedly, formally. In the Oslo agreements we signed, the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Arab peace plan that represents not only 22 Arab states, but 57 Muslim majority countries around the world also agreed with the Arab Peace Plan, which was 2002, in which an Arab summit said to the Israelis, we will live with you peacefully if you implement UN resolutions, which again, get out of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, resolve the refugee issue, and allow a Palestinian state to exist. And then there can be total peaceful coexistence. So the reality of what Palestinians and Arabs are willing to do and want to do is 100% contrary to one of the main perceptions. But of course, these perceptions in the West are fueled by Zionist and Israeli propaganda, which Helena is an expert on. I'll turn it over to her to talk about more misperceptions.
Okay. Yeah, there has been, throughout my whole 42 years in this country, I've lived in a situation. I grew up in England, as I said, and then I spent 7 years as a journalist in the Middle East. But all the time I've been here, there have been dedicated campaigns by pro-Zionist organizations to silence and marginalize any voices, including my own, that dared to say that Palestinians are people like other people. They have God-given rights, and they have national rights that are recognized by the United Nations. And, you know, people who tried to say that have been routinely smeared as anti-Semites. And right now there is this political movement, I believe in your state legislature and many state legislatures, to actually say that criticizing the state of Israel is an act of anti-Semitism, which is absolute nonsense. You know, Zionism and the state of Israel and support for the state of Israel are all political actions, political positions, and Semitism, being Jewish, anti-Semitism is, you know, an odious form of religious discrimination. Two very different things. And of course, as we see today, there are large numbers in this country of Jewish anti-Zionists, both ultra-Orthodox and fairly progressive, very progressive, leftist young Jewish people who are anti-Zionist. So I'll just leave that aside for now. I probably don't need to explain it to your people. So this misperception that Hamas is oppressive and has not allowed, well, there are a number of different strands of this. One is that they haven't allowed elections since 2006. Well, guess what? In 2006, they participated in good order in elections for the PA legislative body that were completely recognized as free and fair elections, and they won them. And then the US government under George W. Bush, Condoleezza Rice, and the Israeli government and Hamas's opponents in the Fatah movement conspired to overthrow the results of those elections. So, you know, for anybody to come now and say, oh, Hamas is anti-democratic, it's exactly the mirror image of what happened in 2006, 2007. And since 2006, true, there have been no region-wide Palestinian legislative elections, because an election is always fought about something. Well, right now there is no legislature that is capable of, you know, actually governing or doing anything. That's number one. Number two is you have the very sad situation of the division of the West Bank from Gaza, when all Palestinians have historically said that the whole of the land of Palestine is a single territory. So you can't split one off from the other. And another point is that actually there have been elections throughout the West Bank and Gaza for professional bodies, for student unions, and, you know, the different political organizations, Fatah and Hamas and the Popular Front and the communists, have all participated in those elections, and very frequently Hamas wins them and very frequently they don't. You know, so it's not that they're incapable of participating in elections or not wanting to have elections. So another thing that is frequently sort of claimed about Hamas is that they're just like ISIS and they oppress women, you know, because they are Islamist. Well, it's true that Hamas as an organization, its leadership, its founding principles are based on this particular democratic reading of Sunni Muslim practices and norms and history. But they're very open to people who are not Sunni Muslims having a full participation, as they did in many Arab countries before the advent of Western colonialism. And that's why somebody like Rami Khouri, you know, the word Khouri, the name Khouri means priest, you know, and most of the people in Nazareth are Christians from the days of Jesus Christ, not Christians made by Western evangelism. But, you know, there's a place for Christians and Jews in this society that is honored and respected and welcomed. And do they oppress women? No. Actually, in Palestinian social norms, social terms, women have always played a strong role in society. If you look today at people like Hanan Ashrawi, you look at great cultural heroes like Fadwa Tuqan, and you look inside Hamas, where after they won the election in 2006, 4 of their parliamentarians were women. So, you know, you need to really look at a lot of the history and practice of this organization. Back in the early 80s, when Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas, was building mosques throughout Gaza and to a lesser extent in the West Bank, he, for the first time in Palestinian history that I know, built mosques with 2 floors for people to worship on. One was for the women to have a full right to worship, and one was for the men. So, you know, maybe it would be better, maybe we think it would be better if they worship together. But, you know, for the women to be able to have their own worship space, actually, historically, that's how Quaker meeting houses were built. You had like the women's side and the man's side, and Quaker women played a big role in things. So, you know, we do in our book, and as we did in the webinar series, really try to take on some of these slurs and just misconceptions. So I hope you read the book and that you learn a lot from it. I think the other thing I really want to stress, several things that are worth talking about. One thing to stress is that Hamas is not just the military wing, which is the way it's presented in the West very frequently. It is a political organization with what you might call a subordinate military wing. I mean, it's, you know, you have the civilian control of the military in Hamas, essentially. So that's one thing. Another is it's not just in Gaza. It's in the West Bank. It's wherever there are large concentrations of Palestinians, including in Lebanon, to a certain extent in Syria, at a political level, definitely in Jordan and the Gulf. And so you have this nationwide leadership organization called the Majlis Ashura, which is the consultative council, roughly 18 people who are regularly elected, and they control the politics. And that's worth understanding, including the fact that actually they're very popular in the West Bank. All the recent opinion polling, and there has been regular quarterly opinion polling of Palestinian opinion in both Gaza and the West Bank, sadly not in the diaspora, because of course diaspora Palestinians are just as much members of the nation as people who are allowed by Israel to live in the homeland. But these regular quarterly opinion polls, which continued up until May of this year, I think there has not been one since May, which is just a tragedy, because of course it's so hard to do that in Gaza under conditions of Actually, Rami, you know, Amnesty has now come out and said it's a genocide. So I think you can stop saying it's a plausible genocide. I think it's a genocide, but whatever. It's horrendous. It's beyond belief. But until May or June, this organization in Ramallah, run by Khalil Shikaki, was doing regular opinion polling. And actually, the support for Hamas was stronger in the West Bank than it was in Gaza. And that's been the case for a long time, but very strong in both places. So, you know, this idea that Hamas rules with an iron hand and is completely, you know, oppressive, it's nonsense. If there were elections, they would participate, but you have to have, you know, the kind of the political framework for elections to be held. And sadly, the Israelis are the occupation force, and they have not allowed elections since the last time in 2006. Let's hope that the General Assembly, UN General Assembly resolution that was passed in September that called for the complete ending of Israel's occupation of the whole of Gaza and the whole of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that whole occupation can be ended as the General Assembly called for within a year. I don't think it's going to happen within a year, but I think it could happen in Gaza within a year and then roll over to the West Bank. Let's hope. And then the Palestinians can enjoy, you know, free and fair elections once again, once they're no longer under the military occupation rule that they have had to endure for 57 years.
We have a question from David who wanted to know, what is the relationship between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority? And we also have a question from Anne asking, how do we best respond when condemning Hamas is presented as a prerequisite, as a distraction or deferral? Like, how can we rehumanize Hamas? And Mary wants to know from both of you, how large a part does AIPAC play in U.S. politicians' disinformation about Hamas? Do they write statements for U.S. politicians? Are they framing the way that Americans need to understand these groups? So three questions there. I hope that wasn't too much for you. Palestinian Authority, looking at humanizing Hamas, and how much of a role does AIPAC play in framing American politicians' understanding and language around Hamas?
So Rami, you set off with whichever of those you want to answer, and then I'll backstop for you.
All right, I will. Let me see. I'd like to answer the AIPAC one, and you can do the two other ones. The AIPAC question is really significant because it is probably the most important political dynamic now taking place in the U.S. and much of the Western world, which is an attempt by pro-Israeli groups or groups like AIPAC, which is essentially an Israeli group, but it's set up legally as an American registered group. But they attempt to silence Palestinians, to criminalize them, and to make it a crime in American law. Now there's congressional resolutions making their way through Congress to make it a crime by law to do things that are considered anti-Semitic because they're critical of Israel, and therefore they're punishable by law. So you can have universities losing their nonprofit status, or NGOs or civic society groups losing their nonprofit status, like people like Amnesty International or whatever, you know, people who do real, genuine human rights works. They could lose their nonprofit status, and this would be a death knell to them. And this would be a decision taken by members of the American government based on a law that is now trying to be passed. So the push, the Israelis, the Zionists in the beginning, and then the Israeli government after 1948 have have very professionally and efficiently been able to influence policymaking, first in Great Britain, and then after World War II in the United States, to influence policymaking to suit Israel's needs and desires. And this has been one of the most successful lobbying campaigns in modern history. And also one of the most criminal, in my view, because everything they've done has virtually everything they've done has contravened fundamental principles of human rights, basic international law, and even domestic law in the United States. So they're trying to silence people in the United States, to prevent people from giving a lecture at a university because it's about Palestine, and some pro-Israeli people, or maybe some Jewish students, or some Christian fundamentalist extremists might say, oh, this topic makes me uncomfortable, and therefore I don't feel safe. And this kind of attitude is now being manipulated to prevent those events from taking place. And this is a fundamental denial of constitutional rights of free speech in the United States. And that's the bad news. The good news is that there are dozens and dozens of efforts by legal groups and NGOs and law firms and institutions to take these issues to court and challenge the Israeli attempt to ravage American laws like they've ravaged international laws. So this is the front line of the battle now. And AIPAC is really in the middle of this. AIPAC has very successfully focused on members of Congress. That's essentially all it cares about, congressional members, Senate and House in the US. And they've succeeded in getting many of their favorite people voted in. And occasionally they've ganged up and defeated a candidate who is critical of Israel. It hasn't happened often, but 4 or 5 cases have happened. That's the bad news. The good news is that more and more people are standing up to this now and challenging it and seeing it as foreign interference in American elections. And there's people exploring the legal situation, whether they should take Israel to court or take AIPAC to court or others for interfering in American domestic politics, foreign interference, because there's laws against that. So this is a situation that I think has seen the Zionist and the Israeli lobbying reach a successful peak, is now being challenged, is now being seen as anti-American in many areas, and is probably slowly going to be less effective here and there. They're still very effective in the White House and in the Congress, but that's really the main focus of what they're doing. There's my cat, by the way.
Before you start, Helena, I just want to point out we are at 8:33, and it's such an interesting topic. We'll certainly continue until 8:45, maybe a little longer, but I'm acknowledging where we are in the time, and so please continue. And if people can stay, excellent. It sounds like there's a willingness to take these questions.
Sure. Well, yes, I appreciate people sticking around. I mean, we could talk about this for a long time. But so the question about the relationship between the Hamas and the PA, first of all. So the PA is this interim self-governing authority that was born out of Oslo, and it was supposed to be just the interim to administer Palestinian affairs until you get the final peace agreement, which was promised within 5 years of 1994. In other words, we should have had the final peace agreement in 1999, never came. So this interim self-governing authority is now a sort of a zombie thing, but it's not just a zombie living beyond its natural life. It is also, in essence, working as a contractor for the Israeli occupation in enforcing the oppression of resistance by non-PA forces and in coordinating everything to do with the occupation, especially in the West Bank. So when the PA was created back in 1994, Hamas and many of the other organizations deeply rooted in the occupied territories and the life of the occupied territories, including the communists, for example, they were all of them, very dubious, both about the Oslo process, which they saw as very badly negotiated by Yasser Arafat of the PLO. And they also saw it as dangerous because it didn't actually state that after 5 years, that would be the end of this interim. So there were the first elections for the PA legislature in 1996. Hamas did not take part, but they did have a cessation of their military operations in order to allow those elections in 96 to take place. In 2006, we had the next round of legislative elections. This time, Hamas not only agreed to hold back on the military actions, but also to participate in the elections. It was a huge sea change for them because these elections were being conducted under the auspices of and within the framework of the Palestinian Authority and Oslo and everything else. And that was at the same time as the prisoners' document, roughly speaking, which came in a few months later. But ever since then, it's been clear that Hamas wants to participate in the Palestinian national governance body. For example, after they won the elections in 2006, Ismail Haniyeh did not actually want to be the prime minister. He said Hamas, which was he was the head of Hamas in Gaza at the time. He said, we want to be part of a national unity government. And it was Fatah and the PLO which refused and said, no, we're going to combat you after you won the elections. So, I mean, I think they are eager still, and that is part of these negotiations that are taking place in Cairo. There's been negotiations in Russia, there have been negotiations in China about how Hamas can join the PLO and the PA, which will come together if it happens. And I do hope it does happen very soon, because obviously, as an oppressed people, it's far better for the Palestinians to have a unified governance body than to have these two factions fighting against each other. So the next question about how should we respond when people demand that we condemn Hamas? What I tend to do is I say, I condemn violations of international law, whoever commits them. And that includes international humanitarian law, that is carrying out war crimes or crimes against humanity or other atrocities, including, of course, genocide. So, if people say, you have to condemn Hamas, I will just say, I condemn everybody who commits violations of international law, but I do support the right of people living under military occupation or the people living under colonial domination to resist those forms of extreme oppression by any means necessary, provided they abide by international humanitarian law. So, we who are white settlers in this country are extremely privileged and have taken advantage of white privilege in this country from the origins of the settlement project here until today. We cannot condemn when people who live under colonial domination or indigenous people in this country see it as their only way to resist is to take up arms. Now, it may not be wise for them to take up arms, and very frequently people resisting colonial domination try a whole range of means, including the Palestinians, including Hamas. Remember that in 2018 there was this mass civilian movement called the Great March of Return. in which Hamas was a fundamental part in Gaza. Prior to that, we had the first Intifada in 1987, mass civilian resistance under very difficult circumstances. Hamas was a part and parcel of that. So they do try to do nonviolent organizing, but they have determined, and that's their decision. It's not for us to judge their decision, that sometimes they need to take up arms and to resist by all means necessary. That's, by all means necessary is usually a code word for including by taking up arms. So once a body or an organization takes up arms, they are bound by international humanitarian law, which is, to discriminate in their targeting between valid targets and invalid targets, and to use laws of proportionality and all the different approaches that international humanitarian law mandates. So it is very likely that on October 7th, 2023, some of the units of Hamas and its allies violated international humanitarian law by targeting civilians. We don't know, but we do know that the majority of the people that Hamas took as hostages back to Gaza were military people. And those are the ones who are still being held. And many of the other people, the civilians who were taken hostage, were taken by other organizations or just by families and clans and who knows whom from the Gaza population that broke out of the Gaza concentration camp that day. So I think, these kind of blanket condemnations that we are asked to perform, do you condemn Hamas? No, I condemn everybody who violates international law, including international humanitarian law, but I support the right of people to resist military occupation and colonial domination. That's what I say. Other people can say what they want.
Okay, let me see if there's a question in the chat. One question from me, maybe the last one is.
Maybe it should be the last, yeah.
Yes, this has been a decimating war. It's just incredible how much the destruction leveled at Gaza. Do both of you think Hamas will survive this? And if not, what else? I know it's difficult to predict anything in times of war, but I'm just curious if this is an example of a militant group that was hammered and did not recover.
Let me make a couple of comments, and then Helena, you can wrap it up. It doesn't matter if the group survives as a group. What matters is the ideas that Hamas represents. So that's I think the main point that we make throughout the book, or when the people make, and we agree that it's a position that Palestinians take, that we have rights. We're human beings. Our rights have been denied. We demand that we achieve them, and we're struggling to get them using all available means, preferably peaceful ones, but sometimes military ones. The Hamas institution has been battered and probably will not exist in its current form. But what Hamas stands for will definitely continue to exist and will be intensified, whether the Palestinians have the capacity and the national unity and the international support to move ahead and achieve those rights is for the future to determine. We don't know. But this idea that Hamas or Hezbollah, have been dealt a fatal blow, you can't deal a fatal blow to the idea of give me liberty or give me death. That's essentially what we're saying: give me liberty or give me death. And that's not an Arab phrase; it's an American phrase. And this is the spirit that has to be appreciated in understanding groups like this. They existed because people were denied their rights. Hamas only came into being in the late 1980s. Hezbollah in the early 1980s. These are not old ancient groups. They are a consequence of Israeli occupation and American British support. So I'll leave it there and leave it for Helena to wrap up.
I'm not sure I need to add much to that. I think I'm probably, I have a higher percentage of probability in my mind that Hamas will survive in something very similar to its existing form than Rami does. But, you know, what he says that the idea will persist is undoubtedly true. Of course, a big part of our concern has to do with the deliberate and intentional, violent and sustained elimination of the people of Gaza that's underway right now. And, you know, you just have to look at some of this footage of the people in their tents, which are not even tents. They are strips of cloth hung over goodness only knows what. And, you know, the wind and the rain come and they've gone. And so that combined with the military assaults against them, combined with the starvation, especially in the north, but also in the south, combined with the destruction of all the basic means of human survival. I mean, I honestly think it's quite likely that by the end of winter, the population of Gaza will be reduced by 50%. People talk about decimation. Decimation was what the Romans used to do to rebels during the Roman Empire. It meant lining up a group of people and eliminating 1 in every 10 of them. Decimation is far less. That's the origin of the term decimation, which gets carried around too much these days when people mean destruction. What is happening now is the deliberate destruction of the people of Gaza, and it's unbelievable to me how anybody can survive that and be mentally together. So we know that there is going to be massive trauma that will ricochet down the generations to come. Because this genocide is the first genocide that has been live streamed. It's the first genocide when we have people who are there, who are talking to their loved ones outside, who are taking photos. I mean, there have been genocides throughout history, including on this continent, including in Australia, including in Southwest Africa, wherever there have been like white settler regimes, there have been genocides, but we haven't had the opportunity, which is an opportunity I don't even want to have, but I feel obliged to witness what is going on in Gaza. So that is really beyond belief a horrible thing that the Israelis are doing. I mean, words are not sufficient. Will it mean the end of Hamas? No. It will mean, I mean, obviously Hamas, as I said earlier, it's in the West Bank, it's in Lebanon, it's in Jordan at a political level, at a very deep political level. It's wherever there are Palestinians. There is an understanding of Hamas, even if there is not membership of Hamas. So the idea will continue. This like 18-member Majlis Shura, most of them are outside at this point. They will continue. They have good links with the people on the inside. I think the movement will continue in some way, but the more their family members get ravaged, the more the impetus is for the leadership to become harder and harder line. So, you know, that is a really, I mean, there are so many reasons to end the genocide, to end the occupation, and to do this through good faith, effective negotiation.
That is a very excellent, although painful ending for a really important night. And listening to both of you, I know I'm animated to do all that we can to stop the war, because it is such a cruel burden to everyone, and so damaging, especially to the generations to come in the whole area. And this, of course, includes Israelis as well as Palestinians, as well as Lebanese. They have endured too much war. So we thank you very much, Helena and Rami, for being with us. Do you want to I have put in the chat box a pitch. Well, actually, Roxanne did. Thank you, Roxanne, for the Center for Nonviolent Solutions. We do appreciate any contributions, especially in this season of giving. But I wanted to give you one last opportunity to tell people where they can get your really important book, maybe as a gift for the holiday, or a gift to themselves, or gift to other people. How can they order your book?
Well, actually, you know, there's a big national online retailer run by a guy called Jeff Bezos, which I tend to call Jeff Bezos's little boutique, because I'm in the book business and we were the first ones to get hammered by Jeff Bezos. You can get it there. You can get it from orbooks.com, which are our publishers in New York, who did a lovely job with the book. And, you know, I urge people, if you get a copy and read it, and buy a few copies for your, you know, local, your members of Congress, your senators, their office staff, for anybody who you think needs to have a better understanding of the politics of Hamas.
Thank you. And tomorrow you'll be doing a commemorative for Rifat al-Arir, the Palestinian poet who was killed a year ago this month. So we want to commend and uphold that. Maybe we can put the link when we send out the recording. But thank
here,
you.
I can put the link right here.
Oh,
no.
Okay.
No, I hang on, let me get this again. Okay.
So for those able to attend, it's a commemoration for Dr. Rifat al-Arir. Helena Cobban, Just Educational, has published his poetry and the works of his students. So you can learn more about his remarkable work and the work of his students, even though he is no longer in the flesh on this planet. His words and legacy live on. So again, thank you so much to both of you, and for all who joined. We greatly appreciate the interest, and we will get the recording out to share with others. So thank you. And many thanks.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Take care, Rami.
Bye, Helen.
Hey, thank you.